Sustainable farming is on the tip of everyone's tongues at the moment, given the threat to the planet and other worrying factors. Campaigners want to create a food alliance with the end goal of sustainability in mind and have targeted the COP27 climate summit in Egypt to persuade countries to join. Today, we are discussing campaigners proposing a food alliance to reduce the climate impact of farming. Don't go anywhere. Let's jump straight in then. What is going on? Food campaigners have long proposed a food alliance to help the world combat climate change that is brought on by some farming methods. Many farming practices are detrimental to the earth, overuse of things like pesticides and fertilizers, but it is difficult to convince a poor farmer to introduce modern farming techniques with the goal of reducing climate change when they are living hand to mouth. Campaigners want to form what will be known as a food alliance, with countries such as Germany, France, and the UK all involved. However, critics have suggested that it is the more impoverished countries which A, need help, and B, are not particularly interested in saving the planet when they cannot even save their own citizens. The Food Alliance would see widespread changes, with farming practices becoming more uniform across the board, all aimed at reducing the carbon footprint of the farming industry. If this were to go ahead, it would be a significant step in the fight against climate change, and campaigners want to use the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, later this year to unveil their new alliance. However, it would act like a domino effect, and when a couple of the big nations join, the rest would see the benefit. However, first of all, we need to address the issue of food insecurity. You cannot expect poor farmers to introduce new practices, which might take time to kick in if they are not able to eat right now. Do you think that this is a good idea? Next up, a disappointing end to climate talks ahead of COP27. Stay tuned. Last month, officials gathered in Bonn to discuss the climate crisis, but as so often happens, very little was actually resolved. Negotiations to tackle global warming failed to make any serious headway, and left to deal with the consequences were, yes, you guessed it, developing nations. They wanted a deal put in place that would see a finance facility set up to help when crops fail due to things like extreme weather and rising sea levels, things brought on by climate change. Of course, the biggest contributor to global warming is the developed world, but the ones who feel it the most are poorer, more impoverished nations, such as Bangladesh, who, as a low-lying country, are very much at risk from rising sea levels. There are also small island nations who would like assurances, but following the conference in Bonn, nothing has been resolved. Conrad Hunt, UN ambassador for Antigua and Barbuda, said, "The climate emergency is fast becoming a catastrophe, yet within these walls, the process feels out of step with reality," which sounds about right, to be fair. Bonn also saw little to no progress on global emission cuts, which critics have suggested leaves a huge task for the COP27 summit this November. Again, at the heart of it all were diplomats, who very rarely seem to get anything done when it comes to climate change, which has left the rest of us wondering, what on earth are they actually doing at these conferences? What do you guys think? Let's have a little look at the relationship between so-called developed and developing countries with all of this then. There has long been tension between the two groups, as developing nations blame the developed ones for creating this mess in the first place, whilst the developed nations castigate their poorer cousins for not making the jump to greener technology sooner. Developing countries also feel as though they should have access to a dedicated fund for loss and damage, which is pretty difficult to argue with, in fairness. For the first time at last month's conference in Bonn, developed nations had acknowledged the huge gap in finance for countries who are at risk from climate change. Incidentally, most of whom had nothing to do with causing the serious problems they are now faced with. I mean, it's about time developed nations take some of the blame. However, rather unsurprisingly, the richer nations, the EU, USA, and Switzerland, simply refused to talk about the new finance facility and wouldn't even allow it to be added to the agenda. I mean, talk about fighting an uphill battle. Instead of using empty words, rich countries must show a spirit of international cooperation and solidarity to engage constructively at COP27 to establish the loss and damage finance facility, said Harjit Singh, a senior advisor with Climate Action Network International. Do you guys think developed nations should do more to help help the developing world, especially given their role in poorer nations' current misfortunes? So, what can we expect from the COP27? Well, analysts have suggested that the conference in Egypt toward the end of the year could be where the world actually puts the Paris Agreement into practice. But that is a very big could. It seems as though every time one of these conferences comes along, it is quickly forgotten about. There is a global goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, and on the agenda in Bonn was how we hit that goal. But of course, there was infighting and bickering, which meant literally nothing was accomplished. For anything to actually get done in Egypt and a solid plan of action to be carried out, nations need to put their own best interests as secondary and think about the greater good of the planet. I mean, what use is it being the most prosperous country on a dead planet? As usual, we can probably expect a well-worded plan from one of the wealthier nations, who will more than likely suggest that any deal to cut emissions should also include developing countries, the same countries who are trying to catch up to the developed world by doing the exact same things they did to get them where they are today. There will then be the inevitable pushback from the developing nations, who will argue, quite rightly, that they should be given the same opportunity the developed countries afforded themselves. And round we will go. That seems like the most likely outcome for us. What do you guys think? Next up, Greta Thunberg has delivered an impassioned plea. Swedish environmental campaigner Greta Thunberg appeared at one of the biggest music festivals on the planet last week to warn revelers of the dangers facing the Earth. She was introduced on stage by festival organizer Emily Evis just before Paul McCartney started his epic set. Thunberg warned music fans that the Earth's biosphere is not just changing, it is destabilizing. It is breaking down. She proceeded to call out world leaders for dancing around the subject and creating loopholes, as she quite expertly put it. She clearly has a fine understanding of global politics for one so young. She then suggested that climate change and the driving forces behind it were a moral decision that will put the entire living planet at risk. And she is absolutely right. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Greta went on to tell the crowd that they had the power to create change, and that we don't have to wait for the politicians to fight back. She said, "We are capable of the most incredible things. Once we are given the full story, we will know what to do. There is still time to choose a new path, to step back from the cliff. Instead of looking for hope, start creating that hope yourself." What an inspiring young lady. Her appearance echoed David Attenborough's appearance at the last Glastonbury Festival in 2019, but sadly, not much has changed since. Were any of you guys in attendance at last week's Glastonbury Festival? And finally, another youngster with a big message. 15-year-old climate campaigner Robin Ridley, who has of course seen lazy comparisons between himself and Greta Thunberg, has a message for British politicians. Robin has been sitting outside Birmingham City Council every fortnight, frustrated at a lack of action. But instead of comparing him to Greta, people should be worrying about how they can do their bit for the climate. Holding a sign which read, "Are you listening?" Robin accused politicians of not taking the climate crisis seriously enough. I mean, you can hardly blame him, right? The youngster was angry at plans to extend the contract of the Tyseley incinerator, which converts waste to energy. But of course, it is quite the pollutant. Robin said they have set a net zero goal for carbon emissions by 2030. However, they have the Tyseley incinerator, in which its contract is being renewed until 2034. They have had a couple of years to get a plan ready so that we can be climate neutral. However, they haven't been successful and they're failing. Robin went on to say he feels as though British politicians are not listening to the people, saying that the situation is really scary. He then urged councillors to do their jobs, saying, "You are supposed to be taking care of this community and making it a safe place. It's not a safe place because in 10 to 20 years, we might not be living here right now." Well said. As usual, thanks for joining us today, guys, and remember to like and share today's video, as well as subscribing to our channel. Bye, guys!